Welcome, welcome, welcome. You are watching Truth, Love, Healing. My name is Kevin, your neighborhood Spider-Man. I'm here on this channel to make these little videos to share hard-earned wisdoms and experiential truth on the spiritual path. My prayer, my intention is to share, hopefully to be helpful and save you some time, some trouble, maybe shed some light, maybe provide some direction. If I do, I'd appreciate it if you like, share, subscribe, comment. Let me know how I'm doing. It means so much, and I'm not just saying that. This video, I want to talk about my two big homies. You might have heard of them. The first one is Jesus Christ, divinity made flesh. And my other big homie is the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama. I'm American. I don't know how to pronounce stuff. But the Buddha, awesome, awesome, awesome. Now, their paths don't conflict. The teachings don't conflict, but they are two separate paths. Buddha brought the path of enlightenment, which is the dissolution of the ego, the sense of personal self, to break the chain of reincarnation into human form that happens again and again and again. Because as Buddha said, that human life is really suffering. You know, it's sickness, old age, poverty, and death. And as one is identified with form, with humanness, with separateness, with a me, we will keep reincarnating, period. So because life is suffering, because no matter how good your life is, it is crumbs compared to the banquet that's sitting on the table when one lets that go. When you're willing to put down the crumbs, there's a nice, enormous steak dinner sitting on the table, or a vegan dinner if you're into that. But anyway, Buddha, he reincarnated through many lifetimes, and he incarnated this last life into an ancient culture in India where the concept of enlightenment was already well accepted, and many have already reached that state. So when Buddha came about, as the legends are stated, his father was visited by a wise man, and the wise man said, your son is going to either be a great king or a monk. And his father, who was a king or a leader, didn't want his son to be a lowly monk. Like, who wants that? I want my son to be a king, a great king. And the wise person told him, he said, well, if your son sees poverty, sickness, old age, and death, he will be a monk. And when you think about it, he was always destined to be the Buddha, because it's impossible to live a life and not see sickness, old age, poverty, and death. However, his father was determined, and he had the ways and means, he thought, to prevent that from happening. So his son grew up confined to this palace, which is also fairly symbolic. Confined to this palace where every single pleasure he could ever want was given to him. However, that lotus flower within him was blooming, and he knew there was something else. What's going on? So one day he escaped from the palace, and he brought his guard with him, and he saw sickness, old age, poverty, and death. And he was traumatized. Like, oh my God, what is this? And from there, the rest was a wrap. I mean, he was on a mission. He had to figure out, what is this about? You know, what is the meaning of life? What is the answer? Because this doesn't make sense. So one day in the middle of the night, he kissed his wife goodbye as she was sleeping, and his newborn son. He didn't want to wake them because he didn't want them to stop him or be emotional. He had to go. And he left in the middle of the night to figure it out. And so he went on a spiritual journey. He sat with many teachers. He learned many things. There was a lot of advancement in consciousness. However, the answer to suffering was never found. And eventually, he had enough. And he said, I'm sitting at this tree, the Bodhi tree, which means awakening tree, I believe. And he said, I'm not leaving here until the answer comes. And he sat, as according to legend, for 49 days in meditation, in prayer, waiting for that answer. And similar to Christ, he was tempted by Mara and her daughters, which is, pretty much the same as Christ in the desert being tempted by Satan. And he refused those temptations. And eventually, the answer was granted. The flower bloomed, enlightenment, the transcendence of the sense of personal self to the revelation of the allness of the love of God. He didn't call it God, which was actually incredibly smart, because the word God has such a program within consciousness. And over time, over the eons, there's been so many gods. I think in India there's like 150,000 gods or something. And, there's been Germanic gods, Roman gods, various gods. And there's just the way God is held as a program, the giant parent in the sky, a being. So Buddha was very wise to not mention God. The traditional religionist tends to dismiss Buddhism as a godless religion, a false religion, because of that, because there's no mention of God. That is a huge, huge misholding of what Buddhism is, what the Buddha was. So Buddha reached enlightenment, and enlightenment is so critical because in the beginning, before the beginning, there was God, God the Father, as Christ spoke it. And without beginning, without endings, without duration, it's not consciousness, it's non-consciousness, source. And then, because God is God and saw that he loved his creation, then came the light, as poetically phrased in the book of Genesis. And as the light, consciousness, touched matter, there came life. And then as consciousness localized in form, there became the ego. Consciousness tends to identify with the form it's localized in. So now consciousness is localized in a physical form. It says, this is me. And it becomes a me. And because of that identification, because of the strength of that, there's a continuation of reincarnation into form, because that is what's held as true. That is what's held as me. It's a pattern within consciousness. So you keep reincarnating life after life. Sickness, old age, poverty, death, and all the horror that tends to happen through being a human. And that doesn't mean that there isn't incredible joy and beauty and love being a human as well. But if you were to take the greatest love you could ever feel, the greatest joy you could ever feel as a human, it is a candle to the sun of divinity. So Buddha broke through, and he broke through that identification of a me and became the Buddha, breaking that cycle. And he shared it so that we all have a path. He cleared a path, and he gave us the way of that path so that we all may follow it if it aligns with our heart. But he, like I said, he incarnated into an ancient culture where that was already a well-accepted concept. However, the tenacity of identification with ego is so intense, and so much of mankind was, and still is, unfortunately, extremely primitive. So enlightenment is really not a practical goal for the vast majority of humanity. So because of this lostness within humanity, this lost identification and primitive consciousness, mankind evolved. The brain, the human brain, is really an evolution of the animal brain. We still have a reptilian brain within us with all its instincts. So if you just look at human history, recorded human history, you see that there's been endless eons of rape and murder and pillaging and just butchering. With that, all those action, karma is action. It's the reverberations. You throw a pebble into the pond and it ripples. That is karma, essentially, really simplified. But because of because of humans' actions throughout the time, through all the misdirection, the karmic debt of that was so enormous. The absolute dimness of the light within us was so amazingly low that there was no chance. So because, as the Bible says, because God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten son. And he saw there needs to be an intervention within the human experience because these guys are lost. And the karmic debt was so enormous. So God the Father sent a ray of light from the supreme Godhead to manifest in the flesh as Christ. Christ consciousness manifested in the flesh. You know, the title is Jesus the Christ. People think Christ was like his last name or something. Jesus Christine. No, Jesus the Christ. Christ consciousness made flesh. The consciousness of God made flesh. And consciousness, Christ, didn't have previous lives. You know, he didn't speak about previous lives and reincarnation because he didn't have any. He came straight from the Godhead, and his mission was very specific. So the first was to teach about the true nature of the kingdom of heaven, the true nature of God the Father, and the serious part was to sacrifice his life to counterbalance the weight of our karmic debt, quote unquote, sin. He died for our sins, is how it's worded. It was that karmic debt. So by him sacrificing his life, allowing himself to be crucified for telling the truth, it counterbalanced the wave of that hell. So Christ knew he didn't incarnate to an ancient spiritual culture of spiritually advanced culture. He came to a culture that was worshiping the golden calf. So this is a primitive culture. To speak about enlightenment was pointless. So Christ, being as wise as he was, as Christ consciousness is, taught about salvation, brought the path of salvation, which is really spiritual purification, which is purification of the ego. You know, the chances of the majority of humanity transcending the ego is so just not happening that it was pointless to say, let's transcend it. It was much more useful, much more practical to teach about the purification of it. Teach forgiveness, teach unconditional love, love thy neighbor, love the Lord thy God is with all thy heart, soul, mind, and might. That was the essence of everything he taught. And he is the truth. He is the way, because he was, it is divinity made flesh. So they're two different paths, the Buddha and Christ. However, both are extremely, extremely high level, high caliber stuff. And I couldn't recommend both more. If you get caught into the belief systems, the religiosity, and the vanity of I know, you're limiting yourself. If you're on this path, Christ and Buddha are everything. So Christ, in my path, Christ is my refuge. You know, Christ is our holy friend. Buddha was our holy light in that he brought that path of all the way out of this madness. Christ is the light and is our friend, our advocate. Christ consciousness became flesh so that we, so heavily identified as form, have something we could look at, something we could understand, something we can grasp, and someone we could ask for help. You know, it's much easier for someone who's so identified with form to focus on something in form and to ask that for help as opposed to some diffuse, abstract concept. So I hope this is helpful. I'm thinking about my time here and what they're going to allow me to make for a video. But Christ, Buddha, two different paths, but not conflicting. Highly recommend them both. Drop the positionalities. Christ, yes. Don't let the religious people turn you off to him. Buddha, yes. Don't let the religious people turn you off to him. Submit, focus on what they are, what the teachings were, and let the rest unfold of its own. This is Truth, Love, Healing. It's been a pleasure. It's been an honor. Your friend, Kevin. Until we see each other again. Like, subscribe, comment, holler.